it's really a pleasure to be here, and yeah, it's nice also to work with an old advisor, an old teacher, scholar, you, John. You've taught me many things from years back. So going full circle here, it's really nice. It's nice to meet all of you also virtually here. I'll just share my screen. Are you seeing that?
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
So, yeah, John, he asked me to talk about how to turn rich data into theoretical insights. And so I was thinking about my own experience, and I really think it's like spaghetti junctures. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, what that really means. But of course, this is a spaghetti juncture was a term that was coined in 1965 in England, and this is the interchange of the M6 highway around Birmingham. And the idea here is, of course, sometimes there is a straight way through a spaghetti junction, but sometimes before the days where you had the navigation systems and so on, you took the wrong exit, and it will take you into a different part of town, maybe a different country, and you could sort of get lost in this, but it could also lead to many interesting observations and insights that you were not aware of. So there's a bit of chance that plays into this, and sometimes a bit of luck navigating a spaghetti junction. And I think this is how you actually get to produce theoretical insights. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I understand I have about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. If there are pressing questions, John, you just navigate that if there's somebody that needs to have something clarified. So what is the aspiration for us as scholars? What are we really trying to do? We are trying to produce interesting articles, interesting work. And what does it mean to do something that's interesting? So I went back to a survey that was done at the Academy Management Journal board members, and they were asked in an article that was published in 2006 by the then two editors, Sarah Rines and Ireland. What would you consider good articles that are interesting? And you can see we have the percentage there in the first column of respondents N83, and then there's like 3 or 4 core categories that the work has to be counterintuitive. It needs to have a certain level of quality, good writing, and produce new theory and findings. So what does it mean when the work is counterintuitive? Well, it needs to challenge something we already know. There needs to be a certain level of aha moment. And by quality, they mean the work needs to be well crafted. It needs to have good technical or good method, good fit between the data and the theory, a sophisticated methodology, and makes what is complex look simple and elegant. And good writing is actually hard to do. And so it's very much about how you frame the story, how do you build momentum, how do you provide good examples, and how do you really have rich descriptions. And then really most importantly at the end, you need to produce new theory. And how do you go about doing that? How do you not just say what has already been said? And at the end of my talk, I'll come back and share 2 tools that I have used myself in my work to try to live up to produce interesting work. But before I get to sort of, here's the tool you can take with you, I'll walk you through some of the experiences that I've had myself. And the challenge here is really, this is something just to show that John's question to me, how do you turn rich data into rich theory, is not really something that he's made up. This is a question that I've taken from ResearchGate. I searched there, and this question, this particular post, it has almost 7,000 reads. And so you can see there's a scholar here that asked, how do you deal with too much data for a qualitative research study? And how do we really deal with a wealth of data? That's the real problem that we're going to deal with. And some of the common frustrations when you, first of all, manage to get access to the data, get all the data collected, is then from the researcher's standpoint is really, how do you make sense of this sea of data? Sometimes you have too much data to organize, let alone present. And the data analysis becomes so complex and convoluted and detailed that it's really hard for the reader to understand. And at the same time, you need to be really rigorous to show that you analyze the data to get to the new insights that you have, but you also need to be a good storyteller. And doing all of this is really complicated. Then we produce a manuscript, we send it to the journals, and what do the reviewers then say to us? Well, you're telling us what's in your data, but you're not really showing it with data quotes or other ways. Or they ask, how do you get from those quotes to that model? I can simply not see the connections. Or they would say, you have some nice quotes, but is that all you got? And so you can really get bogged down, you can get rejected. And for many years, I actually had this message posted on my refrigerator: keep moving forward, because you need to find a way every day when you're dealing with your data that you get a little bit more clarity on some of these points. And sometimes moving forward actually means taking a detour in the spaghetti junctions. Sometimes it means taking the wrong exit. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we move into the talk. But I think having this image and you committing to and saying, I am moving forward every day in small ways, it really becomes important to become a good scholar that can produce good work that lives up to those aspirations. That was on my first slide from the MJ board. So my core message is really something you can remember as a 2x2 matrix, because I think when we are looking at rich data, one problem is that we're only thinking about just a lot of data points. Let me be a little bit more specific. If you are thinking about rich data, data richness can be high and low. And if you're only looking at the number of data points, number of interviews, or if you're counting the number of emails or whatever you have, a high end of that can of course lead to one type of data richness, but another type of data richness is really the variance within and between the specific data points and then the specific quality and depth of the data points. So that leads to this puzzling observation that you can actually have fairly low data richness, but still being able to produce good research that get published in the good journals. This is what in my quadrant that I call squeezing the lemon. But when I was thinking more about how do you actually deal with data richness, I realized what's really important is the medium or the technology that you apply to make sense of that data richness. And that, of course, is the scholar, that is us. So to deal with data richness, we actually need to look inward and saying, how rich are we in the way that we deal with the data? And by scholarly richness, I mean the training that we have, because to look at data, it's sort of just a sea of grayness. And we need a certain set of concepts, a conceptual sophistication to be able to see what's in data. But on the other hand, we also need a certain level of openness so we can see cues that stand out and do not necessarily fit into existing concepts. So to being rich from a scholarly perspective, you need to have a certain holistic understanding of what's going on in the data and in the field, in the theory, but you also need to be very rigorous in your analytical approach. So that creates these 4 different settings, what I call the mission impossible. You have low data richness, but you're not very rich in your scholarly approach. That's probably hard to produce good theory that way. On the other hand, we have here squeezing the lemon in the lower right corner. That is where you have good data, but it is not necessarily overwhelming. There are some scholars that have managed to publish papers. They've done 20 interviews. They spent 3 months studying an organization or studying one particular event, and they're able to produce really interesting and high impact research that way. So if you as an individual is not high on scholarly richness, there are also, of course, different ways you can improve that. You can invite a co-author or 2 co-authors. You can ask for people to help you think about your data. And I'll talk a little bit about one way how I have found a way to do that later in the talk. Then in the top left corner, you have what I call top-down theorizing. So you have a lot of data richness in various ways, either in terms of data points or simply a lot of variance between the data you've collected. But you're simply lucky in the sense that what you know, the concepts that you know, you realize, wow, there's something that's missing in the literature, and my study just perfectly fits what's missing. So you simply superimpose a set of concepts on your data, and voila, it works. Those are sort of the top-down theories, rising and squeezing the lemon. They're sort of the off-diagonal points that are interesting to think about. What I'm going to talk more about is the setting that I call requisite variety. And of course, by that I mean is that you have complexity, richness, and to understand richness or complexity, you need to attack that with a certain level of richness and complexity as well. So this is a very famous principle from that has been written about. If you look up theories about requisite variety, you can see what it's about. And as I talk through my slides, you will hopefully get a sense of what I mean by being scholarly rich. And what do I mean by richness? The quality of having a lot of something that's valuable or interesting. This is from the Cambridge Dictionary. And I've already talked about rich data and how do you turn rich data into insight. It's through scholarly richness. What is scholarly richness? It is about training, it is conception, it's the ability to label what you see in your data and label it in sophisticated and novel ways. And then there's this openness, which I translate into perception. That's the ability to see what others have not seen yet. And then sort of oscillating between seeing and showing. It's one thing to see what you think you see in your data, but to be able to show and communicate that to the reader, that's really a skill in itself. And showing really requires that you apply different analytical techniques and methods to the data, in a sense, to make the data speak, to make what it is that you see that you have not seen, that other people have not seen yet. And here I'm reminded of my co-author, Mark Zabraki. We've had a conversation about this where he said, it's interesting if you think about blind people. Blind people, they cannot see in the way that we can see, but some of their senses, they are sharper than ours, so they can hear better than we can, or they can maybe imagine things better than we can. And through that way, they actually see things in the world that us that have eyes do not see. So the idea is to think about what is it that's not necessarily obviously visible in your data, and how do you pick that up and how do you communicate that to your reader? That is really the difficult task that we're facing. Unfortunately, there's a lot of obstacles for us as scholars to get to richness and insight. Our beliefs often get in the way. I think we have a question here, maybe. So April, you're asking, is there a trade-off between valuable and interesting? Can you have one without the other, or must you have a balance of both to achieve richness? I think that's a great question. I think, why don't you just unmute yourself, April, and explain a little bit more what you mean by valuable.
Hello, I was referring to your previous slide where you, the one right before that, where you mentioned to have the quality of having a lot of something to say that is valuable or interesting. And so my question was referring to that bullet point where you said you have to have something valuable or interesting. Yeah,
I think there's a certain overlap, as you say, between those two constructs. I think one could leave out, the quality of having a lot of something that is interesting. Something that's interesting is often also valuable. So in a sense, can you have data that is not very valuable and be interesting? I find that hard to believe. So yeah, I see that the trade-off that you're talking about, but I also think that the one actually requires the other. Maybe this is something we can discuss a little bit more when I'm through with the talk, but it's a very good question. So getting back to what are some of the obstacles that we face, and I think actually our PhD training is something that really stands in the way of many of us of really becoming able to see and really benefit from the richness. I've worked with a number of students and tried to help a number of students. They have a fantastic data set, but you realize that the questions that they initially asked in collecting the data were not the right questions, and in a sense, they were not willing to be foolish and playful enough in approaching a setting or when they're actually analyzing the data. And I think also the science enterprise has actually become, in a sense, instrumental, that there's a lot of pressure on all of us to publish. So we are less daring. We're doing maybe articles that are less crazy, so to speak. And if you actually talk to editors of many journals, they would really like settings or topics or questions that are a bit out there, but that involves a certain risk. And we know how hard it is to get published. So we are all sort of regressing towards the mean and focusing on something, yeah, this can at least be published. But that also means that it's maybe less interesting what is out there. And I've been a bit crazy in my approach. It's not always worked out, but I'll talk to you in a little bit about some of my projects. They've been taking 25 years before people, they were actually willing to sort of say, okay, you have a point, now I see it. So the question is, how open are you really to crazy and wild new ideas? While we know that most new ideas, they're probably bad, because it's easy to get a new idea, but then when you start thinking more about it, but how do we engage with this? And in a sense, when we are analyzing a data, do you sort of take moments, or do you take a day, or are you challenging yourself to be crazy and foolish and playful and trying to see something that's maybe not obviously in the data? I think this is what really makes qualitative research fun and interesting. And I think we should allow ourselves to do this, but often we don't do that because it is so important to be serious. So how can you, in a sense, sneak in time where you are having fun and enjoying just playing around with your data? Because producing insights that is really what this business is about. And producing insights is the power of actors seeing into a situation with some certain penetration, the act of result of apprehending the inner nature of something, of seeing something intuitively. So this is from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. And so to get to insight, you need to have a situation or some data that's interesting, but you really also need to understand the literature. So this idea of going into the field with a carte blanche, a blank slate, I don't really believe in this. You really need to have done a lot of homework in understanding where the field is and what is already known. Because that way you can be open to then realizing, there's something interesting actually happening in my situation, in my data. You need to be prepared to actually see something that's crazy or novel. And Martin Kilduff, he was the editor of Academy of Management Review. Of course, that's a theory journal where he said that desk rejects are manuscripts that simply review the existing literature, sometimes summarizing literature and propositions, but failing to offer distinctive contribution to theory beyond what has already been written by others. So the key here is really, how do we go beyond existing theory? And if we're doing an empirical paper, how can our data and our situation help us do that? So that's the overlap between those three Venn diagrams: theory, the situation, and insight. And we need to make a conceptual leap. I don't know if Anne Langley, she talked about that in her talk, but she has said very famously in a paper that there's no way of getting moving forward on quality research without a conceptual leap. And so how do we do that? And I've tried to break that down in how I do that myself. And in terms of theory, I ask myself, what is X? And X can be anything that your study is about. It can be career trajectories. It can be green financing. It can be anything. But you need to have an X, and X needs to be fairly narrow. And then you need to ask yourself, what do we know about that X? What don't we know about that X? And based on what we don't know, what is your question or puzzle about X? And then brings you to your data. You start collecting your data. Eventually you start analyzing it. And you then have to really make sure that the X you're theorizing also is in your data. And what is your method and analytical approaches you're going to use to sort of unpack that X, to find a surprise, a mystery, something unexpected, interesting about the X. And then that can lead to an insight, what is new, counterintuitive, unseen about X, and specifically ask yourself, what do you change or challenge in existing theory, and what does it matter? Now, summarize all of this in a nice little table at the very end of my table at my talk, which I work very much with my doctoral students and use myself to get a lot of feedback on the X that I'm studying, because often what we think is a good X and what is unknown about X actually turns out to be known and not be a very cool X. So how do we see in our data? And I think this requires a lot of training. And this is from a little article that Carl Weick, he wrote in Academy of Management Journal in 2007 about richness. And this he refers to Jean-Louis Rudolph Agassiz, who was a Swiss-born American zoologist and geologist who taught at Harvard. So Weick writes, imagine that you went to Louis Agassiz's laboratory at Harvard as a student. Agassiz would place a small tin pan in front of you with a small fish and utter the stern requirement that you should study it, but should on no account talk to anyone concerning it, nor read anything related to fishes, nor use any artificial aids like a magnifying glass until he gave you permission to do so. So the point here is you need to sit with your data first alone, and you should not necessarily feed it into in vivo or any data analytical tool. You should simply sit with it, read it, be frustrated with it, try to make sense of it the old-fashioned way. And then, as one student said, to my inquiry, what shall I do? He said, in effect, find out what you can without damaging the specimen. What I think you have done, when I think you have done the work, I'll question you. Students kept telling Agassiz what they had found, and Agassiz kept saying, that is not right. That went on typically for 100 or more hours with the same now loathsome fish. Agassiz would keep asking, what is it like? Do you see it yet? And saying, you have not looked carefully, and you have 2 eyes, 2 hands, and 1 fish. Gradually, things would begin to change. So the key point here is analyzing data, and qualitative data in particular takes a lot of time, a lot of patience, and persistence is really the key to start seeing what's in your data. Think back to what Mark Zabraki would say, how would a blind person really approach your data? And look at that and start seeing what's unusual and different and counterintuitive. That takes a lot of time and a lot of patience. And no matter what you use of analytical tools, of specific in vivo or whatever, it will never get you to the inside unless you really spend the time creatively and work with the data. And here's some advice that I got from a reviewer that was reading my paper from a journal. I suggest that you look at your data again with a slightly different frame of mind. Rather than to think about what the dominant themes in your data are, think about what is really unique, surprising, or troubling about your data. Does it go against the grain of some dominant belief in the literature? Does it suggest a novel construct beyond existing one? This will help you not only to advance your empirical analysis, but more importantly, to focus on a more compelling research problem. And I think that's really good advice. If there's nothing in your data that is sort of troubling or challenging any sort of assumptions, you've not really looked closely enough at the fish, and you need to look at the fish until it really starts to smell and you really are sick and tired of it. And that's really the litmus test. And you need to then present this to other people before you submit to a journal and say, is this really troubling? Is this something new? And this is how you start to drive around in the spaghetti junctures. Of course, we know the basic steps in inductive research analysis. You have a phenomenon of interest, you have a research context, you have a research question, you collect the data, you do the data analysis, you review the literature, and you do the data presentation and final write-up. This is easy how it looks on paper, but in theory, it is really more through these spaghetti junctions that I really think are important. And I think you should not be afraid in your data analysis and as you move through the data to think about this construction site that you're building these off ramps, and you should not really be afraid to get stuck on a ramp or take the wrong ramp. There may be some of your advisors that would say, this is really bad advice from this Claus Rerup because this takes a lot of time. But truly, my experience is you cannot, it's like the famous song, you can't hurry love. You really can't hurry insight. It takes time to circle around in that spaghetti, so to speak, to find the connectivity between the different pieces. And if your ambition is to write a top level A paper, it just takes a lot of time. But I think it's also gratifying of getting a deeper and deeper understanding of a particular topic and then really engaging with that in a particular way. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the spaghetti junctions that I've been through and gone through. And again, I'm going to follow this upper top corner there of requisite variety. I'll just talk briefly of some of the papers I sent to you and give you a sense of the engagement it really takes. The first paper, Rerup and Zabraki, It's a paper that's forthcoming in Organization Science. I've been engaged in that paper for more than 25 years. It started when I was a doctoral student, and I was interested in the Estonia ferry disaster. I tried several times to get this paper published because in my data, it showed that from learning from this sinking of the Estonia disaster in 1994, where about 860 people, they died, I identified that there were a number of people, they were telling stories that were based on, nowadays you would call it fake news or conspiracy theories. When I submitted this work to review, people, they would say, but this is not real data. You cannot really write a paper about that. This is nonsense. And then to my surprise, the best thing happened. Donald Trump, he was elected as president and started to talk about fake news. And suddenly what we were talking about in this paper was really interesting. And then the reviewers started to like what we were talking about. I have a question here.
No, it's not a question, just agreeing with you, Klaus.
Okay, super. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Mike. And so sometimes the timing is not right for your cool idea because the field and the people are somewhere else. And of course, then you work on something else, but you don't give up on this. It requires a certain level of persistence. And now politics in learning is really something that's a really hot topic. And there was a special issue in 2009 in Organization Science that says, it's really surprising that there are so few people that study politics, but it's really hard to get the data also to do this. So I'm not going to talk more further detail about this paper. The second paper there by Claus Rerup, this paper, in a sense, I got engaged in 2002. I was a postdoc at the Wharton School. Claus Rerup, he was a visiting doctoral student there from Italy. He asked me to look at some of his data from the Alessi company in Italy. It was interesting, and I gave him some ideas for his work. Time passes on, we became friends, and Carlo, he invited me to become a visiting professor at Bocconi. Then he had invited me then to Milan. I spent a year in 2011. We started to work on some of his data, and we submitted the paper for review in 2012, and eventually the paper was published. And this paper dealt with the question of, in the literature on routines, usually you would have one routine that solves one task. And Carlo's data suggested that there was one routine that could solve two tasks in product development. And the reviewers, they told us, this is nonsense. This goes against what all the literature says. And we said, but this is what's in our data. The reviewers, they sent us out to make more interviews and collect more data. We came back, now we have even more evidence. And then in the end, the reviewers, they had to say, you're right, the theory was wrong. But this took some convincing. And the paper then by Strike and Rerup, it is Vanessa Strike. She was a PhD student at Ivy, and I was her dissertation advisor. And it is based on a study of 6 family firms family firms, they have a very interesting advisory structure. They have advisors that are sort of known, and you can find them on their website. And then they have something that's called the most trusted advisor. And the most trusted advisor is someone who is sort of in the background, a bit invisible, but advises the family, and they trust that person very much. And in Vanessa's data, it focuses on the sense-making literature. And the sense-making literature basically assumes that sense-making is a very local theory of local practice. Think about Carl Weick's famous study of Man Gulch. It's about 13 firefighters that jumps, and some of them are killed. Or think about an operating room, or think about a cockpit. What this study shows was that the family business decision makers and entrepreneurs, they were really the local theory, but then there was these advisors that were outside of the local context and how they were mediating what was going on. So this paper, in a sense, changes how we think about sense making, and it also introduces a temporal perspective to sense making, which very few people have focused on. What I'm really going to talk about is the last paper. It's a shame that Hans Sigor is not here, because Hans Sigor was actually the director of this research center, Learning Lab Denmark, that I studied in Denmark. And this is a paper I co-authored with Martha Feldman, and it is also set in the routine dynamics literature. And this paper really challenges the theory about trial and error learning. And I'll talk in particular about this paper because I collected all the data, and in that sense, I don't compromise any of my co-authors because this is all the data that I have and can sort of tell you about very detailed what happened. So this paper, I'll be honest with you, it was extremely difficult to be published. I'll talk about that in a second. But of course, I'm very pleased that in August 2016, this paper was recognized by Web of Science as a highly cited paper and is placed in the top 1% of the academic field of economics and business based on citations. So how did this happen, that we sort of hit the jackpot, so to speak, to produce a paper that lives up to the standard, so to speak, of the first slide I showed to you of what the AMJ reviewers would expect of a paper that challenges really existing literature. Question here.
No, ignore, just ignore. Thanks.
Good. So what was the richness of the data that it took? I was engaged in studying this new public venture, Learning Lab Denmark, which Hans Sigor was one of the founders of. It was sponsored by the Danish government. They were looking for somebody to follow the establishment of this new initiative. I applied for that. I was interviewed in 1999, in 2000, and eventually we signed a contract. I just finished my PhD in 2001. So this became sort of my new data collection project. And they were very supportive in allowing me to collect all the data. You can see over a decade, I did a lot of interviews, a lot of meetings. The data is just really deep and fantastic. But that's really no guarantee for getting things published. I had established an advisory board. James Marchi had been co-supervisor on my thesis at Stanford. Then I moved to Wharton, where Dan Leventhal was my advisor, and Mark Zabracki was also there. So I realized it was a good idea to have some more experienced people around me that could help me improve this richness, people that had read different things, that saw different things. And to my surprise, in my data, it started to fit a paper that Martha Feldman and Brian Pentland published in 2003 in Academy, in ASQ, about a new approach to routine dynamics. So I wrote a draft on my paper, sent it to Martha Feldman, and I didn't hear from her for 6 months. So I thought, oh well, this was not a very good idea. Suddenly I get a very enthusiastic email back from her and says, wow, this is fantastic. This could really be the data that sort of proves or really helps solidify what Brian and I have been talking about. So we started on this paper, and I said, wow, I'm working with Martha Feldman. This is going to be a piece of cake. And this was really, really hard to publish this paper. I'll talk about that on my next slide. The paper went through 6 major revisions, 6 reviewers. The paper was conditionally accepted on the 4th revision, and it still went through 2 more revisions, and they added 2 reviewers. And this just drove all of us crazy, but we worked through it. And this was very difficult because my tenure case really depended on this. And I'm not kidding you, the day when I was going up for tenure, I knew I did not have the right amount of papers to get tenure. A conditional accept comes from the journal. and that changes the whole game. And then the committee then have to meet again, because it's a committee with some esteemed scholars. They have to meet in 6 weeks because it's vacation and so on. And in that time frame, I have another paper accepted for publication. So I just made it because of this sort of cliffhanger. So this is why this paper is very important to me. And you can see what the reviewers, they say here. And this is sort of the message that comes through here is really empirical data, and the quality of the data is really important. Reviewer says, this is a very interesting empirical study. You are to be congratulated for gaining access to a novel research opportunity. Such access is rare and valuable. It's underpinned by a robust approach to data collection. The method section is a strong part of the paper. So the reviewers, they could really see we have the data, but we have not crafted the paper well enough. And you can see reviewer 2 says, this is a very thoughtful paper, and you can see that you've gathered data in an interesting setting. We have reviewer 3 that says, serious efforts to process questions, and it draws on patient data accumulation and analysis. In a second, I'm going to talk about the criticism of the paper also, but this is a good start. You can see without the data, we would never have made it. So this is from me being a reviewer and on the editorial board of several of the top journals. I've probably done 200 reviews of qualitative papers, and this is just a summary of the primary reason for rejecting a qualitative paper is you get in to revise the paper if you have good data and a good idea and the promise to making a contribution, but you get rejected if your findings are intuitive, uninteresting, you fail to do anything with your data that's implication for theory, you overlook obvious theory. And you can see Martha and I, we were guilty as charged of these problems. So the editor says, there's some problems. The reviewer 1 says, like all qualitative empirical studies undertaking opportunistically without a clear theoretical framing. And this was a real insult because I have thought very, very carefully about the theoretical framing. And the reviewer here thinks that we've just, gone into the field with no idea. And then says you're left with this thorny issue of how to make sense of your data. And you're thinking in terms of where you're making a contribution, your theoretical position are still underdeveloped. And reviewer 3 then says, there's some areas where you say you have a new idea, but it's actually not really new. So you're really not on top of the literature, right? And so this was a bit like, wow, okay, we got to work more. And so then we started to do our spaghetti junctions. We are looking at this new organization, and because it's a new organization, we can see, wow, it has a lot of problems getting everything started, hiring people, basically writing contracts for bringing people on boards. So we map this in a simple way. What is the insight here? Well, it's not clear. This was sort of a tour in the roundabout, so to speak. Was it a wrong exit? I'm not sure, because later on, these problems that persisted actually turned out to be really important. So this is why being stuck in the spaghetti for some time is actually important. Then another spaghetti junction was we wanted to really understand the aspiration of the organization. They really wanted to be new. They wanted to be very professional, but we observed a lot of near failures in mailing out materials to the people they were hiring. There was a lot of tension between standardization and being different. There was actually a lot of resistance in the larger university environment that the Learning Lab Denmark was embedded. And there was these cycles of interplay between what we call the ostensive and the performative element of the routine. So the ostensive is the description of the routine and how they were actually enacting it. And you can see there, that led to the routine formation. And we could see there was something here about role structure and power of authority. but there's no any key insight here. There's some ideas, but it's not really getting any traction. So this is us again driving around in this spaghetti junction. But there's something here about tension that we realized was really important. So that led us then to do a semiotic cluster analysis. And we realized in the data, there was a lot of competing meanings. In the data, Learning Lab Denmark was described as a family, as a private organization, as international, as a clone of the MIT Media Lab, as Maverick. So you can see all of these descriptions. And then we said, what is really the connotative meaning of this? Well, there's something here about a market logic. There's something here about a community logic. There's something about being world-class. There's something about being professional and non-bureaucratic. And this was all related to hiring the right people. And then there was some institutional concerns here. There was something really about having a very strong identity about being entrepreneurial. But on the other hand, there was also a lot of pushback and saying you have to follow the law and the rules. And then there's this thing about legitimizing new ideas and then really not delivering. And the people that were funding them, the Danish government, they said, but you're sort of this hot air balloon. How can you really claim that you're new without showing this to us? That then led us to try to present this in a different way. Another tour into the spaghetti and trying to make a little bit more sense of it and saying there's something here about style, about how they actually do things and what they do. And that then leads us to having this relation between style and content that leads us to a further analysis that now really is starting to help us to get somewhere, that Learning Lab Denmark wanted to be a Mode 2 organization, which is sort of an alternative organization. It was in 20 years ago, this was really novel if you wanted to be a Mode 2 organization. We wanted to communicate the research process. And you can see there's this tension here, and that really becomes what our analysis is about. There are different expressions. This idea about bureaucratic predictability, they needed to follow the Danish labor laws. But on the other hand, Learning Lab Denmark, they wanted to hire people quickly. They wanted to pay them more than they were paid in the traditional public university. That creates a lot of tension. And this tension between Learning Lab Denmark saying, how can we bypass, how can we in a sense create a workaround so we can hire people with high salaries, but still follow the Danish law? That became the core insight of the paper. And those of you that looked at the paper, you can see how we find a way to really map this in a really nice way. And this really becomes a way of how is it the Learning Lab Denmark is engaging in trial and error learning to write hiring contracts and developing new routines for hiring these people. So you can see, I hope you get a sense of 5 years through the spaghetti here and the persistence that it takes until you sort of have the beautiful model that sort of summarizes everything and that you can communicate very clearly. And I know I'm a little bit over time, but I'm getting into really the last stretch of my talk here, John. I have maybe 1 or 2 slides and then the wrap up. And through this process, how we really managed to so I'm not the editor of any journal right now. I've actually stepped down from all editorial boards because right now I'm in a senior administrative position as the vice president of research or the dean of research. So I'm basically managing 100 researchers, and it's a mouthful. So I've had to take a break from working with the journals, but once my term here is over in 3 or 4 years, I'll come back to that. But these 2 questions here turned out to be really important, and it's been really instrumental in me developing my work, is that if I cannot answer these 2 questions in my own work, and I ask when I review a lot of people to answer these questions, if I cannot answer how my work changed, challenges, or fundamentally advance our knowledge of particular concepts, relationships, models, or theory embedded in the literature on X, I have nothing. And for me to structure this, you can see this is basically a 3x4 matrix. So you have change, challenge, and fundamentally advance on one dimension. And then you have concepts, relationships, and models, and theories on the other side. So you have these 12 quadrants. And if you cannot write anything in any of these quadrants, you have a big problem, because you don't have a study that makes a theoretical contribution. And of course, you don't need to have any, you don't need to fill all the 12 quadrants, but you need to think about how you're filling some of the quadrants. And that then becomes your linchpin, then really for articulating a very strong contribution. And that then leads to the second question. How does your work cause us to think about X in a way that would not normally be anticipated from extrapolation of existing work, and thereby advancing future work in an important way? And you can look at these two papers, how we've done that specifically this way. But I think these two questions, you must be able to answer them. And your way through the spaghetti and the junctions, they need to be focused on in your analysis of being able to answer these two questions. And this is, again, from the Rerup and Feldman paper. What really made the trick finally in this paper getting published was in the discussion that we could show specifically that from the classic Carnegie School approach to routines and trial and error learning, that we were actually, we're saying investigating three assumptions, but we're actually challenging three assumptions. We're actually saying the theory is wrong based on the data that we have. Of course, that could be a dangerous approach, because people, they can easily get very defensive. So you need to write this up in a particularly elegant way, so it doesn't seem like you're coming swinging at people. But basically, you can see the three assumptions that we challenged, and we basically build up the discussion by saying, here's what the existing literature thinks, assumption one, here's what we found in our data, here's what that means for the literature, and basically, here's what our insights are. And that's what we did for all three assumptions. And then overall, we sum up and saying, so here's why our paper is great and why it should be published. And here's how it builds on existing work. And that was a very difficult part of the paper. Once we got that right, people, they said, okay. And this was really breaking the ground for other people to start to publish empirical papers on routine dynamics. So what's the wrap? It will just take 5 minutes, and then I'm happy to take all your questions. So one of the ways that I have found very useful in moving through these spaghetti junctions and actually crafting an entire paper is that you need to think from the first page to the last page, and it actually needs to form an arc. Because what you say in the first page needs to line up with what you say in the last page. And here, I really found the two Karen Goldenbiddle and Karen Locke, extremely insightful. On the reading list, I referred you to the AMJ paper they have from 1993, where they lay this out, but they have also a book from 2007 that's called Composing Qualitative Research. And so first of all, they say you need to articulate the study's significance. We've talked about this a little bit earlier about what is X. What is really cool about what they do is what they talk about situating the study in the literature. And there are three approaches to this, what they call synthesized coherence, progressive coherence, and non-coherence. So synthesized coherence is basically you're putting pieces of research together that's not been put together before. And it creates this contrast that can create a new contribution. Progressive coherence is basically where you say, this is how the field has developed over time. It is now here, and the next step in the field development involves doing this. Non-coherence is that you say that there's some disagreement or controversy in the literature, for example, there's evidence that shows X, there's evidence that shows Y, and our study resolves this. Then you need to problematize. You really need to make space for your study and argue why your study is important. It's not important. It's not enough to say X has not been studied before, so this is why I do it, and this is why it should be published. You need to provide arguments why this is important. You know, you've not studied zebras with underwear. So because zebras in underwear has not been studied before, hence my study is important. Of course, this is an extreme silly example, but you get at what I'm saying. You really need to problematize and argue and convince why this is important. And this can be done through, again, 3 steps, what they call incomplete, inadequate, or incommensurate. Incomplete, you identify a gap. It can be looking at particular context, extension of a particular research. Rather than just look at a gap, I recommend that you look at puzzle, something that's mysterious, something that's inadequate, you know, there's a shortcoming, assumptions that were made that were not appropriate. You can see how this helped us to frame the Rerup and Feldman study. Incommensurate, you want to reformulate or redirect the literature. You're setting up advocacy for a new research approach. This is basically what Feldman and Pentland, they did in the 2003 article where they introduced research on routine dynamics. And then you need to foreshadow how your present study addresses this problematization in the introduction. If you do this well, you basically have your introduction, and then each of these sections become an expansion on your literature, of your methods, of your findings, and your discussion. So I strongly recommend that you review this. And here's my own little trick, my own little tool that I have used and use a lot. When you write a paper, a qualitative paper, you want people with more experience or more expertise than you to give you advice. So I tried this myself. I sent a paper 30 or 40 pages to someone famous or someone who's an expert. And do they have 3, 4, 5 hours to read your paper and provide feedback? No. So they turn down your request. They don't get back to you. And I said, what could be a way where I can get people, how can I get people to say yes to me? That was basically the question I wanted to find an answer to. And I said, what if I create this table with these 7 questions that I've talked to you about before, about X, and then I put this in a table and I send that to them. Anyone can read 3 pages and maybe they can just talk to me for 15 minutes. It could be a colleague in your department. It could be a fellow PhD student. Once you've done this a number of times, maybe you get more courageous and you send this to somebody you think is an expert on your topic. And for example, to question 2 or 3, what do we know about X? What don't we know about X? You've written 20 pages, and it might just take one person to look at this for 20 minutes and says, all that you say that we don't know, we actually know that, but you just looked the wrong place. This will save you a lot of time, and it will increase your chance of getting published. So you add a question, does data analysis method add rigor to the data collected? Yes. Why don't we take that question when I'm done with this slide and the last one, then I'm actually done. Please just remember to ask that question again when I hand it over to Professor Ulhøj. And you can see the idea here is for you to really condense your study into 3 or 4 pages. And this can be really difficult. Writing these 3 or 4 pages, it can take a week. And I ask my students, okay, I talked to you about this. When I meet you next week, I want you to send me this table 3 or 4 pages in advance. And I can see how well do you actually grasp your entire study. And I can very easily pinpoint, this is right, this is wrong. No, you should look at this. If you consider this to be the important literature, you should actually do this. or if you're thinking about analyzing the data this way, I think you should do it this way. You get a lot of feedback, and you get a lot of feedback from a lot of people from 3 pages. And so far, I never met anyone that said no to me. Anyone can do 3 pages. So try it out. And of course, feel free to copy, steal this 7 questions, but be kind enough to say that you stole them from me, but use them as much as you can. And this is my second to last slide. This might seem overwhelming to do something that's get published in the top journal. But from this study about swimming, you know, this study by Chambly about how do you actually get on the Olympic team, he focuses on studying swimmers and realizes it's an ethnographic study of swimmers that eventually make the US Olympic swim team. And to his surprise, he realizes there were about 4,000 athletes that had the raw skill to be on the Olympic team. Many of them, they actually fail to progress throughout the years that it takes to get to the Olympic team because of their attitude. They say, it sucks to get up 4 in the morning to jump in cold water. I don't like this. Many of them, they start to get into puberty. And excuse me, they find the opposite sex or maybe the same sex more interesting than jumping into a cold pool of water. So that really then starts to be related to discipline. And discipline also is very much focused on to diet. And most of all, technique. Technique when you swim, if you swim crawl, I do it this way so you can see that when you hold your hand is really important, because the way you flip your hand depends on how much oxygen and actually resistance you have in the water. So the exact angle of your hand matters. And this comes back to Louis Agassi's 100 hours looking at the fish. You need to train for hundreds of hours how you jump in the pool, how you hold your hand. And what's very cool here is that superlative performance is really a confluence of the dozens of small skills or activities, which have been carefully drilled into habit and then are fitted together in the synthesized whole. There's nothing extraordinary or superhuman of any of those actions, only the fact that done consistently and correctly and altogether produces excellence. And what's very cool about this, all of us control our attitude, our discipline. We might have to learn some technique, but you control 2 out of 3. So you have a cool start. We can all do this. This doesn't matter that you get your PhD from Wharton or Stanford or any top school. It matters how much you're willing to jump into the cold water, how much you're willing to get, confused in the spaghetti and take the wrong turn and come back on the highway again. And then learning the technique from studying, from learning from others, talking to others. So this is my very last slide. I'm sorry for going a little bit over time. 5 to 10% of all submissions that are published in A journals, they're rejected, including my own. So all of us, we really need to find joy in failure. This is really, really hard to do. We all fail at this. And this is why discipline is so important. Persistence, maybe more than IQ, is perhaps the most important virtue in the scholar. Of course, you need to have a certain upper level of IQ, but Jim March, who was an amazing advisor for me at Stanford, he said to me, I prefer to work with somebody who has an IQ of maybe in the 120 to 30 to 40 range rather than in the 100 to 70 range, because you're smart enough, but you have the persistence and you don't think you're so smart that you don't actually have to jump in the pool. So this really becomes really important that you're persistent. And I I really looked up to Jim March, who unfortunately passed away. And at some point, you know, I thought he couldn't fail. And he said, of course I fail. Most scholars, if they're good, they have a batting average of 50%. That means, you know, every paper they submit gets accepted in a journal or a good journal. He showed me his draw of rejections. It was and some of the papers in that draw were just fantastic. He said, I just never got to work on them again. So if somebody who is as, you know, good as Jim March has papers rejected, then the rest of us, we can also just say, yeah, it is okay. And we just got to work a little bit more on our persistence, on our attitude, on our technique, and our discipline. And here, the final message is really, if you're serious, then really being a scholar, that's really a calling. It's not a job. It's really your identity. And it's really about finding joy in the failure and continuing and saying, you know, maybe I can be an inspiration. It only took 25 years for me and Mark to publish our paper about Estonia, but it did get published. And in the meantime, we became friends and we learned a lot about many things, including scholarship. So I'll end here, and now I'm ready to take your questions, and thank you for your patience.
Can I go?